Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are really going to challenge a core narrative. We're looking at one of the most consistently misunderstood periods in history, the Age of Judges.
And when you say misunderstood, I think for most people, if you mention the Age of Judges, they immediately think of a dark age.
Exactly. It's this classic failure narrative that's been taught for, well, millennia. It's this repetitive four-part cycle.
Right.
The people stray, they commit apostasy, then God punishes them, an enemy oppresses them, they cry out, they repent, and then finally God sends a judge, a deliverer, to save them.
And then rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Over and over, painting the whole era as just one long series of spiritual relapses and national failure.
Yes, but what if that's not the real story?
Well, our synthesis of the sources suggests that this traditional narrative is deeply misleading. It's a theological interpretation that was applied much, much later.
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically challenge that conventional wisdom.
Completely. We want to establish a new perspective. That the Age of Judges wasn't a history of failure and betrayal. It was actually a testament to persistent, tenacious, and frankly, fiercely effective resistance.
Okay, so we're redefining this entire 400-year span. But to do that, you're saying we can't actually start with the Book of Judges.
No, you can't. We have to start with a concept that is absolutely fundamental to the faith identity of Israel, but is also, profoundly misunderstood in popular culture.
Right.
We have to start with the Holy War.
A holy war, that's a loaded term.
It is. And here is the core principle we have to grasp before we go any further.
Yeah.
The Holy War, in its original pure biblical sense, is not a mandate for conquest. It's not about expanding territory in God's name.
Okay.
It is, paradoxically, a concept of war that aims to eliminate the very wretchedness of war itself.
War to end war.
Specifically, it means waging war to confront and defeat systems where the strong brutally crush the weak just because they can. By the logic of power, this counterintuitive idea is the key that unlocks the true identity of the judges.
All right, let's unpack this then. This idea of war as a fight to end the tyranny of strength. Our sources trace this idea, this true holy war, not to Joshua or the conquests, but way, way earlier.
All the way back to the patriarch Abraham.
Which is surprising.
It is, but this origin story is absolutely vital. It establishes the blueprint for what absolute faith looks like when it's put into physical action. You find it in Genesis chapter 14.
So let's set the scene for what we're calling the first real holy war. You've got four massive, powerful Mesopotamian nations. This is a true superpower coalition.
Big players of the day.
They form an alliance, they invade southern Canaan, and they are devastating. They just crush 5 small city-states, Sodom and Gomorrah included. It's a war of pure dominance. They loot everything, take captives, a total scorched earth campaign.
And what makes Abraham's response so profound is his location, his geography. He was living near Beersheba,
Which is the southernmost tip of Canaan.
Exactly. The invading forces came from the north and east. They'd already done their damage and were heading home. They had absolutely no reason to go that far south.
So geographically, politically, materially, this was literally none of his business.
None of his business. He wasn't threatened. His property was safe. He was in no immediate danger whatsoever.
So why does he do it? Why does Abraham, a man whose whole deal is to trust God and move toward a promised land, suddenly throw himself into a massive international conflict against the world's strongest military alliance? It can't just be about his nephew, Lot.
Lot's captivity is the trigger. It's the catalyst. But if it was only about Lot, Abraham had options. He was a wealthy, influential man.
Right, he could have negotiated a ransom.
He could have negotiated, he could have waited them out, sought some kind of diplomatic solution, but the situation went way beyond a personal relationship. It was an identity crisis for him as a person of faith.
An identity crisis.
Yeah.
How so?
The core question was this: can a person who believes in a righteous God just stand by and watch a global superpower coalition annihilate small, defenseless cities simply because they have the power to do so?
To remain silent would be a betrayal of his faith.
It would have fundamentally negated his covenant, his identity. Silence in the face of that kind of overwhelming, calculated evil, the tyranny of the strong over the weak, would have been an act of apostasy, just as much as bowing to an idol.
And we really have to emphasize the odds here. This wasn't a fair fight.
Not even remotely. Look at the math. Abraham mobilizes just 318 men.
318.
These are his household staff, basically, with maybe a few local guys he convinced to join him, and he's facing the combined battle-hardened armies of the ancient world.
Militarily, that's not a risk. That's suicide.
It is. There was no rational battle plan, no strategy that could possibly predict success.
And this is where I guess the whole concept of faith shifts into a higher gear. It's not Abraham thinking, oh, if I pray hard enough, God will make my 318 men stronger than their thousands.
No, because that's still transactional. That's still calculating an outcome. This is something else entirely. This is the faith of what the sources call absolute justification.
Absolute justification.
We often point to that incredible statement from Daniel's three friends when they're facing the furnace. They tell the king, our God will save us, and then they add the crucial part. But even if he does not, we still cannot compromise what is right and bow down.
Even if he does not. That's the key phrase.
That's the absolute justification. The action itself is mandatory because it is ethically and spiritually right, completely separate from the consequences or the probability of success. The fight against the tyranny of the strong is an absolute cause.
So that's what's driving Abraham. He believes that even if he fails, even if he and all his men are killed,
That staying silent, doing nothing, would mean giving up his faith entirely, his standing before God. The need to resist was more important than the instinct to survive.
and this connects to that theological concept, kenosis.
It does, deeply. Kenosis means emptying or making oneself nothing. The source material ties Abraham's readiness to die in this fight directly to this. It's that required self-negation, the willingness to give up personal gain, survival, all worldly calculation. That's the precondition for aligning with God's absolute will.
If he'd stopped to calculate, what's in it for me, will I survive, he would have been playing the world's game.
Exactly. His act of war was the ultimate refusal to play that game. He placed the ethical mandate above everything else, and that sets the standard for every judge who comes after him.
And then against all odds, the unbelievable happens.
He wins. He defeats this massive coalition, recovers all the captives, gets back all the looted property. The sources just say God delivered them into his hand.
But the real test, the proof that this was a holy war and not just, an opportunistic raid, comes right after the battle.
Yes, the king of Sodom comes to him. And he offers Abraham a deal that was standard practice in the ancient world.
The deal being,
You return my people, but you can keep all the spoils, all the material wealth, the captured goods. It's all yours.
and this is where it gets really interesting, because any other general who pulls off a victory like that, they'd expect to be made a regional king, right?
Yeah.
Or at least gain huge authority and wealth.
It was the standard reward for victory. But Abraham refuses, adamantly. He makes a vow not to take so much as a thread or a sandal strap.
Why?
He says it explicitly. Lest the king of Sodom say, I made Abraham rich. He completely rejected the chance to gain immense wealth or political power from his fight for justice.
He fought injustice but refused to profit from it.
Exactly. He just quietly goes back to his simple life, empty-handed but spiritually whole.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us? Why was it so important that our sources insisted we start here with Abraham and not with the judges?
Because of what happens immediately after this act. Right after this profound demonstration of absolute faith-resisting injustice and rejecting worldly profit, God initiates his first formal covenant with Abraham. This proves, beyond any argument, that this specific kind of faith, the refusal to calculate cost, the insistence on justice for the weak, this is the true essence of the patriarchal faith. This is the standard. This is the yardstick we have to use to measure every single action of the judges that follow.
So if Abraham's faith, this radical anti-establishment commitment to justice, is the standard, why does the Age of Judges look like such a disaster in the traditional telling?
Right.
That endless, depressing cycle of apostasy, punishment, repentance, salvation. It seems to completely contradict this incredibly high standard.
It does, and the answer is complex. It requires us to look at who actually wrote the book of Judges. This is the critical revelation. It's all about the massive time gap and the interpretive filter of later generations.
The brother-year gap you mentioned earlier, we have to really drill down on that.
Yes. The book of Judges wasn't a diary. It wasn't written in real time by someone living through that chaotic Iron Age. The primary collection, the editing, the final version we have, that happened centuries later.
How much later?
500 to 800 years later, give or take. But critically, it was finalized by descendants who were living through the absolute trauma of the Babylonian exile, or just after, when they were trying to rebuild their entire identity from scratch.
So we're not reading pure objective history. We're reading history that's been filtered through the immediate desperate needs of that exilic community.
Precisely. You have to put yourself in their shoes. They had lost everything: their nation, their capital city, their temple, and maybe worst of all, their identity as God's chosen people. They were in profound despair.
So they looked back at their history not for, like, academic accuracy.
No, they were looking for meaning. They were holding up the past like a mirror to try and understand their catastrophic present, and more importantly, to find a roadmap for their future.
I get the desperation, but isn't it a bit dangerous to suggest the historical account itself might be skewed? Does that undermine the text for a listener?
I don't think it undermines its theological reliability. I think it enhances our understanding of its purpose. The writers of Judges were theologians first, historians second. They had one single, crushing question they needed to answer.
Why did God let this happen to us? Why the exile?
Exactly. And that famous cycle apostasy, discipline, repentance, salvation, that was the mechanism they developed to answer that existential question for themselves.
So it was a theological device,
Yeah.
a framework.
A brilliant one. A rhetorical framework that was necessary for their survival. It served three essential functions for them as exiles. First, it justified their current suffering.
Oh, so?
They had to look back and, maybe magnify the sins of their ancestors, the apostasy, to explain why their current punishment, the destruction of the temple, was so severe. If the past sin was huge, then the present discipline made theological sense. It wasn't just random divine cruelty.
Right, it gives it meaning. So what's the second function?
It provided a template for hope. The message was, look, our ancestors strayed and God disciplined them through the Midianites or the Ammonites. But when they truly repented and cried out, God always sent a deliverer, a judge, to save them.
So, therefore, if we, here in Babylon, truly repent, God will send a new deliverer and restore us.
You've got it. It turns the narrative from a sad history of failures into an instruction manual for the present. It's an exercise in national therapy, in hope building.
And the third function?
Continuity, the very repetition of the cycle. Sin, salvation, sin, salvation. It assured the exiles that even in the darkest times, God's relationship with them was still active. Even when the people failed, the covenant held. So this contextualizes the whole book. We aren't just reading a list of events. We are listening to the desperate, hopeful voice of the Babylonian exiles trying to solve their current crisis by interpreting their past.
That's a huge shift. So the perceived failure of the Age of Judges might not be a failure of the people who actually lived it, but a necessary retrospective interpretation by people centuries later who were trying to explain the loss of everything.
We have to hold both realities at once. The narrative framework imposed later and the gritty, underlying historical reality of the people who are actually resisting oppression year after year.
Okay, so let's try to peel back that thick theological overlay. Let's get to the people on the ground. What was the actual reality during the Judges period before it was framed as this cycle of sin?
The reality on the ground was unrelenting. It was fierce and it was utterly exhausting. It was a relentless age of decentralized local resistance against chronic oppressors. The Midianites, the Ammonites, the Philistines.
The sources really paint a picture of life lived under just decades of constant insecurity. We have to try and visualize this for the listener.
Imagine living on the edge of starvation, subject to these annual, perfectly timed raids. Year after year, without fail, marauders sweep in right at harvest time. They don't come to conquer and settle.
They just come to steal.
Everything. The crops, the livestock, the economic fruit of an entire year of back-breaking labor. They reduced the Israelite communities to hiding in caves just to survive the plunder.
And this wasn't just for a year or two. The book details these shockingly long periods of oppression. 20 years of hardship, 7 years under the Midianites, 18 years under the Ammonites, 40 years of Philistine pressure, all requiring continuous tribute payments. That's generational suffering.
It is. Now, if the Age of Judges was truly a history of immediate and total spiritual failure, where people just betrayed their faith at the first sign of trouble,
They would have just given up.
the Israelite community should have simply dissolved. Historically, that's what happens to small, weak tribes under that kind of constant, devastating pressure. They get absorbed by the dominant culture. They start worshiping the stronger gods.
But they didn't. And that is maybe the strongest piece of counter-evidence against that whole failure narrative.
Absolutely. Despite the profound hardship, the poverty, the violence, the material shows that the Israelites stubbornly refused to abandon their core identity, their core faith. Their ultimate resistance was cultural and spiritual.
They kept saying, "We will not serve the gods of Canaan."
They insisted on the covenant of Abraham. And what's more, their faith was so persistent, their identity so resilient, that they actually managed to absorb some of the surrounding Canaanite tribes into their faith community. They consolidated and strengthened their identity instead of losing it.
The very fact that the Israeli community was still cohesive and strong enough to form a unified nation under Saul and David proves that the Judges period had to be one of persistent success.
Success and fidelity. They successfully resisted total assimilation for centuries under unbelievable stress.
So those long cycles of oppression, 20 years, 40 years, that wasn't necessarily God's punishment for sin. It was just the brutal geopolitical reality of the Iron Age, and their survival is the proof of their success.
It was an age defined by sheer tenacity, the refusal of a small group of people to bow to the logic of power. They were living Abraham's absolute justification every single day.
Okay, so if these judges were the leaders of this tenacious, continuous resistance, and they were rooted in that Abrahamic absolute faith, we have to re-examine the individuals. Because their traditional reputations, usually defined by their flaws, seem to clash with this idea.
We have to measure them against Abraham's standard. Did they fight the tyranny of strength, and did they reject personal gain? And we should start with the one who best embodies the community's ideals.
Deborah.
Deborah.
She is instantly revolutionary. I mean, in a deeply male-centric ancient world where leadership is all about bloodline or being the strongest warrior, she serves as the supreme leader, the Sasa, the judge, for 40 years.
The shock factor is immense. You look at the surrounding cultures, the Canaanite city-states, the Philistines' leadership was strictly patriarchal kingship or military might. And here's Israel, elevating a woman to the highest offices in the land.
And she wasn't just a figurehead. Or, a prophetess they consulted sometimes.
No, not at all. The sources are clear on her multifaceted roles. She judged complex civil and criminal cases. She taught the sacred law, what the sources call the law to the whole community. And she was the commander-in-chief in wartime, the highest legal, educational, and military authority.
That just demolishes the idea that the community was spiritually floundering. Her rise to power proves that their criteria for leadership wasn't gender, it wasn't social status, it wasn't wealth.
So what was it?
What was the number one criterion?
The material clearly shows the decisive factor was who was most orthodox and knowledgeable in the law. The system was meritocratic, and it was centered on fidelity to the covenant.
Man or woman, priest or layperson. It didn't matter.
The person who best understood, interpreted, and practiced the law became the leader. That is a remarkably advanced political and social structure for the Iron Age.
While everyone else is relying on brute force and hereditary titles, the Israelites are elevating a leader based on pure intellectual and spiritual merit.
It speaks volumes about the persistence of that Abrahamic faith. Her 40-year reign, which brought 40 years of peace, is maybe the strongest evidence that the community was actively seeking alignment with God's will, not just falling into paganism. She wasn't an anomaly. She was the system working as intended.
Okay, from the ideal to the most difficult. Jephthah.
Yes.
He presents one of the biggest challenges to this whole model. Traditionally, he's remembered as rash, a fool who makes this tragic conditional vow and ends up sacrificing his own daughter. That seems like the absolute opposite of wisdom and fidelity.
And that traditional reading is a perfect example of the kind of moralistic, simple lesson that later writers who were focused on individual failure often imposed on the stories. We have to strip that away and look at the brutal historical context.
They were in a war for survival.
Yeah.
Against the Ammonites, who had oppressed them for 18 years.
Right. And what's the number one problem for any leader in a desperate war? Mobilization. How do you convince fathers to send their sons into a battle they'll probably die in? Fear and hesitation are the natural response.
So as the leader, Jephthah had to show that he was sharing their sacrifice, that he was truly all in.
Equal to or greater than what he was asking of them. Now let's look at the vow. First, we have to start with the absolute prohibition in the law. Deuteronomy 18.10 is crystal clear that human sacrifice is an abomination to God.
So Jephthah, as a leader elevated for his knowledge of the law, could not possibly have intended to literally kill his daughter.
It would instantly invalidate his entire mission, his identity, everything. So we have to reinterpret the vow through the lens of profound shared sacrifice. His daughter was his adunctal, his only child.
He knew exactly who was most likely to come out and greet him.
Of course he did. And she represented his future, his lineage, his inheritance. The vow then isn't about death, it's about dedicating her to a life of service,
So what he's vowing is to give her to lifetime service in the tabernacle.
effectively condemning her to celibacy and ensuring the end of his own family line. It was the ultimate personal sacrifice. He was saying to the community, I will suffer the ultimate personal loss, the end of my name, to secure your survival.
It's an act of self-negation.
It's a radical act of self-negation that transforms him from a fool into a tragic, profound leader, and that aligns perfectly with Abraham's absolute commitment. It's not rashness, it's a heart-wrenching pledge of a shared burden.
Okay, that brings us to the final and maybe most conflicted figure of all. Samson. He seems totally inconsistent with the Abrahamic standard. The traditional view is he's a narcissist, a strong man who failed because he was chasing pleasure. The classic cautionary tale of personal weakness.
And this is where the filter of the Babylonian exiles, looking for moral lessons, is maybe the most visible. Because if all the judges are supposed to embody this absolute faith and rejection of worldly gain, Samson's story just doesn't seem to fit. It's all personal vengeance and sexual pursuits.
A leader of absolute faith should be fighting for community liberation, not settling personal scores or chasing Philistine women. The traditional story feels like it was designed to teach a lesson about temptation, not to convey the reality of the resistance.
So we have to have a strong suspicion that the story we have has been heavily edited, or at least framed in a very specific way. The question becomes, if he was a leader of resistance, what was the massive injustice he was actually fighting?
The enemy was the Philistines, and they were the most advanced, most organized threat in the region at that time.
Right. And the Philistines didn't just oppress Israel politically, they enforced an iron monopoly.
An iron monopoly.
Literally. They were the only ones allowed to smelt and forge iron weapons and tools. Israelite farmers and fighters had to rely on old bronze tech or go hire a Philistine smith for everything. It gave the Philistines absolute economic and military dominance.
That system is the very definition of the tyranny of strength.
It is. It's designed to keep the weak perpetually weak. So if we look at it through that lens, when Samson commits his famous acts of seemingly random violence, burning fields, tearing down temples, maybe they aren't personal revenge.
Maybe they're targeted acts of sabotage against the machinery of Philistine oppression.
Yeah. That's the necessary shift in perspective. If we apply the Abrahamic lens, his violence, brutal as it was a continuous, decades-long resistance against this system of economic and military control. His personal flaws may have been magnified by later writers, but the underlying reality was that he was perpetually engaged in a holy war.
And the final scene, pulling down the pillars, dying with his enemies, that's always seen as the final failure of the flawed hero.
But if you view it through the lens of absolute justification and kenosis, it's the ultimate act of self-negation. He chooses to empty himself completely, to die, in order to strike a final decisive blow against the very symbol of Philistine power. He gave up everything, including his own survival, to fulfill the mandate of resistance.
It's the purest, maybe most violent expression of Abraham's commitment to justice, regardless of the personal cost.
The mission itself, fighting the tyranny of the Philistines, is entirely consistent with the true meaning of holy war. The key takeaway here is that we have to keep questioning the narratives we inherit, especially the ones that reduce these profound political and spiritual struggles down to simple moral lessons.
So today, we've really undertaken a huge shift in perspective. We've moved from viewing the age of Judges as this depressing cycle of spiritual failure, this dark age of betrayal,
Right.
to seeing it as an age of tenacious, gritty, and ultimately successful resistance. An age where faith meant confronting crushing injustice without even calculating the possibility of victory.
And we have to remember that history is always written by the survivors. The real power in the Book of Judges is hearing that desperate voice of the Babylonian exiles. Their theological framework, that cycle, was a necessary tool for them to reclaim their future. But it means we have to dig underneath it to find the true, absolute conviction of their ancestors.
We confirm that the Judges weren't failures. They were leaders of conviction, fighting for decades against relentless oppression and surviving without being assimilated. They upheld a meritocracy where the law dictated leadership, as we saw with Deborah, and they demanded radical self-sacrifice, as we reinterpreted in the tragic decision of Jephthah.
And that foundational concept of holy war, the fight to end the tyranny of strength, that's what allows us to reevaluate the entire era. It forces us to ask why these people persisted. Why didn't they just dissolve? The very survival of the community is the ultimate proof of the success of the Age of Judges.
Which brings us back to that final provocative thought. It brings us back to Samson. If he truly was a leader of resistance, driven by this Abrahamic concept of absolute faith, what was the massive, crushing injustice he was really fighting?
We've established it was the systematic tyranny of the Philistine power structure, both political and economic. So what if the purpose of Samson's story isn't to warn us about personal weakness? What if its message is about the absolute necessity of resistance, no matter the form it takes? What if the life of Samson is meant to show that sometimes fulfilling the mandate of absolute justification means choosing radical, even self-destructive action to defy a tyranny that the world says is unbreakable? We have to keep questioning these inherited narratives, lest we mistake a fierce fighter for a simple failure.